Hello everyone. Welcome to our comprehensive video on NgRx, a powerful state management library for Angular applications. My name is Sushma and I am happy to share my knowledge with you inspired by the great response to my previous Angular 19 video. In this video, I will take you through the world of Angular data management using NgRx, covering all the essential concepts you need to know. We will combine theory with practical implementation, just like our popular Angular 19 in one video to help you prepare for interviews and real world projects. As an Angular developer, having NGRX skills can be a game changer, especially for complex applications with multiple data sources where data management is crucial. This video is designed for both beginners as well as experienced developers. So here we will start from scratch, understanding the principles of NGRX and Redux, and then dive deeper into each key concept, including actions, reducers, effects, and selectors. We will even build a complete CRUD application using Angular with NGRX. So before we begin, I encourage you to watch this video till the end and become an NGRX master alongside your Angular skill. You can also use the timestamps to jump to a specific topics, but don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below after watching. So let's get started with the introduction to NgRx. Under this, we will cover what NgRx is, why Angular developer need it, and additionally, we will explore the principle of NgRx. So what is NgRx? Ng stands for Angular and Rx stands for reactive extensions. So NgRx is a state management library for Angular applications that helps to manage complex application state and improves application performance. And it builds on the principle of Redux, which is also a popular state management library used in JavaScript applications. So by combining Redux principle with Angular strength, NgRx provides a specialized state management solution for Angular application. However, to learn NgRx, you don't need prior knowledge of Redux, but you must have a solid understanding of Angular. So let's move forward, assuming you have a solid fundamental in Angular development. Why do Angular developers need the NgRx library? Let's understand this with a diagram. Consider this is an app component with two child components, user component and product component. And each of these component has its own child components, like user1 and user2 are the child component of user, and product1 and product2 are the child component of product. And here, if user1 or user2 component wants to share data with the user component, then we can achieve this by using @output decorator. And if user component wants to share data with user1 or user2 component, that also we can achieve by using the decorator @input due to their parent-child relationship. Similarly, product1 and product2 component can share data with product component using @input and @output decorator. But in large applications with complex hierarchies, there are often multiple components and data sharing between them can get complicated. For example, what if the last component user2 needs to share data with product2 component? Since these two components don't have the parent-child relationship, so in this case, we can't use @input or @output decorator directly. And this is where NgRx comes into play. It helps to centralize data and enables communication between unrelated components. Therefore, state management is used to transfer data between components in large application, and for small application we can transfer data using @input and @output decorators and using services. But for complex application, we should use NgRx for state management or data management. So this is how you can explain the need for NgRx. Now, let's move forward and understand the principles of NgRx. But before diving into NgRx, let's quickly understand the principles of Redux. It is an open source JavaScript library for managing application state. And Redux is based on three main principles. First, single source of truth called store. The state of the entire application is stored in a single object. Second, state is read only. meaning the state cannot be changed directly. Instead, actions are dispatched to trigger changes. And third, changes are made with the function called reducer. Reducers are pure functions that take the current state and an action and return a new state. Now, keeping these three Redux principles in mind, let's explore the NgRx state management lifecycle. NgRx follows the principles of unidirectional data flow, making it easier to manage and synchronize the state of an Angular application. And the main section of NgRx is store, which holds the entire application state. And an Angular application, multiple components interact with the store. For example, consider a counter functionality. So for that, this is the counter component, and the counter component requires two actions, increment and decrement. And the application state is updated in the response to these actions. So here, the reducer contains the logic for holding these actions and updating the state. And once the state is updated, it's stored in the store. And to access the updated state in the component, we use the selectors which receive data from the store. So this is the high level overview of how NgRx works. Additionally, NgRx has another building block called effects, which handles complex actions like interacting with the backend API through services that we will explore practically later. But for now, we will focus on understanding the main architecture of NgRx. I repeat, in NgRx, the state management lifecycle starts with an action being dispatched from the component, which triggers a reducer to update the state based on that action, and the updated state is then stored in the store. And this is a centralized storage for the application state. Then components use selectors to retrieve the necessary state from the store and update their UI accordingly. And lastly, effects handle side effects like API calls, ensuring the predictable and scalable state management process. So this life cycle ensures that state changes are predictable, making it easier to manage complex applications and debug issues. So with this, we have covered the basics of NgRx. Now last, let's discuss when to choose NgRx and when to choose Redux in your applications. Both NgRx and Redux are state management libraries that help to manage global state in applications. While Redux is a general purpose state management library and NgRx is specially designed for Angular applications. So first let's discuss when to choose NgRx. First, we should choose NgRx when building complex Angular application with global state management needs. Next, we should choose NgRx when using TypeScript and wanting to leverage its type safety feature. And third, we can choose NgRx when looking for a simpler store setup process with built-in features like effect and selectors. So NgRx is a good fit for these three scenarios: complexity, TypeScript, and simple. Now, when to choose Redux? We should choose Redux when building applications with non-Angular frameworks or when working on non-Angular projects. We can also use Redux when needing a general purpose state management solution that works seamlessly across multiple frameworks. So, in these two scenarios, Redux is a suitable choice. And ultimately, the choice between NgRx and Redux depends on the specific needs of your application. So that is all about the theory behind NgRx, and I hope you understand it. Now, next, let's set up the environment for our practical exercise. And to do this, we will need to follow 4 steps to create an Angular application with NgRx. First step is to download and install a Node.js version greater than 18.19.1. If you navigate to this URL, you can find the latest stable version of Node.js. Second step is to install the latest version of Angular using the command npm install -g @angular/cli@latest. Also, you can hit the command npm install -g @angular/cli So this command is also install the latest version of Angular. Next, third step is to create a new Angular project using the command ng-new project name. And the last and fourth step is to add the NgRx store and effects using the command ng space add space @NgRx slash store and ng space add space @NgRx slash effects. And by following these four steps, we will have our Angular project with NgRx setup. So let's implement these four steps in our system. So according to our plan, we need to create an Angular project which requires Node.js and Angular CLI to be installed. And since I already have Node.js and Angular CLI installed, I'll skip those steps. But let's verify the versions. Let me open the command prompt. And for Node.js, we will run command node space -v. And for Angular CLI, we will run command ng space v. And as you can see, I have already installed Node.js version 20.16.0, which is greater than 18.19.1, and Angular version 19. So now let's move on to the third step, creating new Angular application using command ng-new project name. Here I'll open one more CMD, and here I'll hit command ng-new space Angular slash NgRx. The Angular slash NgRx is the project name. Now hit enter. I'll choose SCSS. Then I'll type Y for SSR and again Y for routing. And project is created successfully. Now let me go inside the project Angular-NgRx. And now I'll open the same project inside Visual Studio Code Editor. For that I hit command code space dot. And inside Visual Studio Code Editor, let me open the package.json file. And here we can see that the Angular project version is 19. Now let me close the terminal. And if I open the app.component.ts file, and here, if I try to import the store, import store from @NgRx slash store. Then you can see here I'm getting an error saying that cannot find module @NgRx slash store or its corresponding type declarations. It means NgRx is not installed in our project yet. Because NgRx is a separate library, in order to use that library, we need to add it in our Angular project. So to fix this error, we will follow the fourth step, that is running NgRx command for store and effects. So let me open terminal here, and here I'll hit command ng add @NgRx slash store. Enter, type Y. Again, I need to type Y to proceed the installation. And package is installed successfully. Now I'll open our package.json file, and here I'll search for NgRx. And as we can see here, NgRx store package is added with the latest version 19.2.0. But here, if I type the NgRx slash effects, there is no result for NgRx effects. So let me install that as well with command ng add @NgRx slash effects. Here, alternatively, you can use command npm install @NgRx slash store or effects, depending on your preferences. So I'll go with ng add, hit enter, press Y to proceed the installation. Package is installed successfully. And if I search NgRx slash effects, this time we can see the NgRx effects package with version 19.2.0. So now inside package.json file, NgRx slash store and NgRx slash effects packages are added with the latest version 19.2.0. Also, if I navigate to the appconfig.ts file, Here you will see that by default it has added two entries, provide store and provide effects. Now save the changes and let's revisit the app.component.ts file, and here the error has gone, indicating that we have successfully installed NgRx in our Angular application. So with this, our environment setup is complete. Now let's run the project using command npm start or ngserve Control C, CLS, and I'll hit the command ngserve space hyphen hyphen open. This command will launch the default UI in the browser, and everything should be working as expected. Okay, so let me close the remaining tabs. And this is the default UI of Angular application. And as you know, this session is all about the installation of all dependencies and setting up the environment. So far we have created the Angular application and added NgRx store and NgRx effect packages inside that Angular application. Now next, to speed up the development process and avoid coding from scratch, let's add Bootstrap to our project. And we will do this in two steps. So let me paste the steps inside this Visual Studio Code editor. And to install Bootstrap in Angular application, first step is to install Bootstrap using command npm install bootstrap. And the second step is to add the CSS and JavaScript file paths to the angular.json file. So by using these two steps, we will integrate Bootstrap into our project, making it easier to build the UI. So let's try to install Bootstrap. So here inside new terminal, I'll hit the same command npm install bootstrap, hit enter, and this command will add Bootstrap to our project dependencies. And once complete, Bootstrap will be added to the node modules folder. So let's verify that. Let me go inside node module folder, and here I'll search Bootstrap. Here you can find the Bootstrap folder, and inside this folder you can find two more folders, CSS as well as JavaScript. Inside CSS you will find the bootstrap.min.css file. Similarly, inside JavaScript folder, here also you will find the bootstrap.min.js file. And these two files we need to add inside angular.json file. That is our second step. Before that, inside package.json file, we can see the installed Bootstrap version 5.3.6. And with that, our first step is successfully completed. Now let's move on to the second step, that is adding the paths to bootstrap.min.css and bootstrap.min.js in the angular.json file. So let me copy the CSS path from here and let me go inside angular.json file, and here under the options inside array I'll add comma, and inside double quotes I'll paste the path for bootstrap.main.css. Similarly, inside script I'll copy the JavaScript path and paste it here inside double quotes. Now save the changes, and after updating the angular.json file, let's restart the application with command ngserve. Port 4200 is already in use. Okay, let me close this terminal, and here let me clear this terminal with command cls, and here I'll run the project with command ngss for serve. And you can see our application is compiled successfully. Now to test if the bootstrap is working, I'll add some bootstrap classes into our HTML file. So let me go inside the app.component.ts file, not ts, HTML file, and let me remove all this default UI. And here I'll take one h2 element with bootstrap classes, text success, and text center. Press tab, and inside this h2 element, I'll add heading, welcome to NgRx series. So inside this heading, text success and text center are the bootstrap classes, and this should center the text and make it green. Now let's open the browser, and yes, we can see the heading in center and it is in green color, which means Bootstrap is working as expected. So with these two steps, we have successfully integrated Bootstrap into our Angular NgRx project. So as per plan, we need to install Node.js. After that, we need to install Angular version 19. After that, we need to create the Angular project, and then we need to add the NgRx packages inside that project. So these four steps we need to follow in order to set up the environment. And apart from these four steps, we have installed the Bootstrap library to speed up the development process. So far, we have completed the Angular 19 project setup with NgRx library. And since we are working on standalone components, we can see the provide store and provide effects entries in the app.config.ts file. And if you are working on a module based Angular project or one that doesn't use standalone components, you will typically find these two functions in app.module.ts file instead of app.config.ts file. And these provide store and provide effects are functions used to configure the NgRx store and effects in an Angular application. Especially, provide store is used to register reducers with the NgRx store. It takes an object with reducer functions as a values, where each key represents a slice of the application state. And provide effects is used to register effects with the NgRx store. And effects are also functions that handle side effects, such as API calls or other asynchronous operations. Okay, so in this section, we will understand how to register reducer inside provide store function. We will explore this with an example soon. But before that, let's add an essential Chrome extension that will enable us to properly debug and track state changes in our application. And for that, you need to search for Redux DevTools on the Chrome browser and click on the first link. Then you just need to click on this Add to Chrome button. Then click on Add Extension. And once you add this extension, you can see the another button, Remove from Chrome. Now after this step, navigate to the localhost 4200 where our application is running. Here, open the developer tool and click on this double arrow symbol to find the Redux tab. So from here, you can navigate to the Redux tab, and as of now, no store is available in the app because we haven't set up the store yet. So in order to debug the application in Redux DevTool, we need to install another library called NgRx Store DevTools. So let me go back to Visual Studio Code Editor, and before installation, let me show you the NgRx folder from Node modules. Here you can see that inside NgRx folder, only two packages are installed so far, NgRx Effects and NgRx Store. Now let's open the new terminal and install NgRx Store DevTool. And to install NgRx Store DevTools, we need to use command npm install @ngrx /store -devtools -save. You can also use command ng-add instead of npm install. Okay, so this time I'll go with npm install. And once you press enter, it will take a moment to install the library locally on your system. Okay, so here you can see added one package, and also we can confirm this in NgRx folder where we now see three packages: effects, store, and store DevTools. And also if I navigate to package.json file, here also you can find all three packages: effects, store, and store DevTools. Now next, let's configure the store DevTools in appconfig.ts file similar to provide store and provide effects. So here I'll add provide store DevTools, and we need to import it from NgRx store DevTools. Import provide store DevTools from @ngrx /store DevTools. Now inside provide store DevTools, Here we can add various properties to customize its behavior. According to the NgRx documentation, if I open ngrx.io, get started, and here go inside developer tools and click on NgRx store DevTools, and here inside instrumentation section you can find all the properties such as max age, log only, auto pause, name, monitor, and more. So for detail on each property, kindly refer this documentation. And note that all properties in the provide store DevTools object are optional. So for now, I'll configure provide store DevTools with max age and log only. So I'll copy these two properties and paste it inside appconfig.ts file under provide store DevTools. Alt Shift F, format the document and save the changes. So here, max age property determines the maximum number of actions stored in the history tree. It's set to a number greater than 1, or we can set it false for infinite. Okay, so I'll go with 25. And once this 25 limit is reached, older actions are removed from the history tree. And log only is a boolean that defaults to false. And when set to false, the extension's full features are enabled. Now, let's check the application. The Redux DevTools should appear with the tabs like action, state, trace, etc., which means we have successfully set up Redux DevTools. And this is an important tool for state debugging. Now, next, let's try to populate this DevTools with a sample state. And to do this, we will create an interface for a list of employees and define its initial values in a reducer. So inside Visual Studio Code Editor, I'll create a new folder under app folder called state. And inside this folder, I'll create two files, store.ts for the interface and emp.reducer.ts for the reducer. And make sure that for the interface, you need to use the .ts extension, and for the reducer file, you need to use the .reducer.ts extension. Now, in the store.ts file, I'll define and export an interface. Export interface, interface name iStore. And inside curly brackets, I'll add four properties. ID of type number, then name of type string, then username of type again string, and last email of type string. Now next, in the emp.reducer.ts file, first I'll define and export the initial state called initial state. So export constant initial state of type read-only array, and inside triangular brackets, I'll pass the created interface, that is iStore. And once you press enter, the import statement will get add automatically. Equals to square brackets. Now inside this array, we can add the objects. So first I'll add one employee object with properties ID, 1, name Alex, username again Alex, and last email alex@gmail.com. Okay, so this is our first employee object. Now I'll duplicate it 2 more times to demonstrate multiple data points. I'll change the ID to and 3. Okay, so we have added the dummy data inside this initial state. Now we need to pass this initial state through a reducer. And to handle the initial data, we need to create a reducer using the create reducer function. So after this array, let's export a new reducer. Export constant reducer name. I'll write emp reducer equals to create reducer. In order to create reducer, we need to use create reducer function. And inside this round brackets, we need to pass the initial state. Once you provide the brackets, here you can see we need to pass the initial state. So inside bracket, I'll pass the initial state where we have added 3 objects in an array. Okay. So this is the code we have to write inside reducer file. First, we have created initial state and added dummy data inside that. And then with the help of create reducer function, we are passing the initial state. Now, after doing this, if I check the Redux Dev tool, I won't see the data yet. And to make the application state visible, we need to register the reducer. So the last step is to register this EMP reducer. And we can do this in app.config.ts file by adding the reducer to the provide store configuration with key value pair, where key is the state name, for example, employee or employees, colon, value is the reducer name, that is EMP reducer. Click on this EMP reducer so that it will import from state folder. Okay, so employees is the key and EMP reducer is the reducer name. You can provide any key as per your wish, but the reducer name should be matched with this reducer name. Okay, so this was our last step, that is a reducer registration. Now, if I revisit the browser, we can see the list of employees under the state tab. And the data is nested under the state name we specified when registering the reducer, which in this case is employees. Here we have specifies employees. If I specify the EMP, then we can see the data under the state name EMP. Okay. Control Z, employees, and the data is rendered under the employees state name. And since we have added 3 employee objects, 1, 2, 3, we can see them in a single array. Okay. So to recap, we have set up the Redux DevTools and rendered dummy data in the state. For that, we have created an iStore interface, then added dummy data inside the initial state, and then passed it to a reducer. And last, to render data in DevTools, we have registered the reducer using the provide store function in appconfig.ts file. So with this, we have covered the basics of application state, including how to pass data to a reducer and register it. Now let's dive into the actual NgRx flow with a practical example from scratch. And we have already covered the principles of NgRx in the introduction. So let's apply those concepts to build a counter example. I'll open Visual Studio Code Editor and let's create a simple counter example to demonstrate the NgRx flow. So for that, inside app.component.html file, I'll go ahead and restructure the document. Here I'm taking one div with class text center and I'll shift this heading inside this div. And I'll update this class with text primary. I'm adding one HR tag and then inside H2 element, I'm adding text app counter colon. I'll bind a counter variable using string interpolation. And I'm creating the same counter variable inside class file of the same component, counter of type number equals to 0. And now again, I'll go back to the template file. And after this H2 element, I'm taking one more div. And inside this div, I'm adding 3 buttons for increment, decrement, and reset the counter with Bootstrap class, btn, btn success, and margin 2. Button name is increment. Also, I'll add the click event equals to I'll assign function on increment. Now I am creating 2 more buttons, one for decrement and one for reset. For decrement, I'll update the function with on decrement, and for reset, I'll update the function with on reset. Also, I am changing the button color to btn warning and btn secondary. Now let's define these 3 functions inside the class file on increment, on decrement, and on reset. And in on increment function, we will increment the counter by 1, counter plus plus, Similarly, in the onDecrement function, we will decrement the counter by 1, counter minus minus. And in the onReset function, we will assign the counter value to 0. Okay. Now save the changes and let's run the project using command ngserve. And once I navigate to the localhost 4200, as we can see, 3 buttons: increment, decrement, and reset. And once I click on the increment button, the value of app counter is incrementing, and clicking on the decrement button, the value of app counter is decrementing. Similarly, if I click on the reset button, the counter is resetting to 0. It means our counter functionality is working as expected. Now next, I'll create 2 new component using command ngGenerate component, component name admin, and another component ngGenerate component, component name user. And after creating these 2 components, I'll add the selector of these 2 components inside app component.html file. So here I'll take one more HR, and after that inside div with class row, inside this row I'll add one more class called 6, and inside this I'll add the selector of app user and app admin component. So now user and admin components are the child component of the app component. Let me import these 2 components inside the imports array of the app component class file. Admin component, comma, user component. Now, if I navigate to the browser, we can see the user component as well as admin component. And now I want to display this updated counter value in these 2 components along with the app component. So in such scenario, we can make use of NgRx. Also, while learning Angular 19, I covered component communication exploring 5 different approaches. If you want to recap, you can find the detailed explanation in my Angular 19 series. The link is available in the description below. However, in this NgRx series, we will focus on using NgRx to share the counter value from parent component to child components. And to achieve this, we will follow a step-by-step approach. But instead of diving straight into the code, let's first understand what are the steps we need to follow. Because by understanding the process, you will be able to create your own examples using the same steps. Let me open the PPT and let's explore the steps to implement Angular state management with NgRx. So the first step is to create actions. In NgRx, actions represent events that trigger state changes. For example, user interaction API call, or we can say form submission, logins, or data retrieval. Like in our counter example, we will define 3 actions, one for incrementing, one for decrementing, and one for resetting the count. Okay. Next step is to create a reducer. After dispatching an action, the reducer is triggered to update the state, and it takes the current state and the action as a inputs, applies the necessary logic, and returns a new state object. In our case, the reducer will contain the logic for incrementing, decrementing, and resetting the counter based on the actions dispatched. Next step is configure the store. In this step, we will register the reducer in the app configuration file, effectively storing the state in the NgRx store. And this setups the store to manage the application state using the reducer's logic. Next step is to create selectors. Selectors are functions that allows components to retrieve specific slices of a state from the NgRx store. And they provide a way for components to access the state they need, making it easier to manage and reuse the state logic. Next step is to define an interface. This step is optional but recommended. To ensure type safety, it's good practice to define an interface for the state instead of using generic type any. So this step helps to catch type related errors at compile time and makes the code more maintainable. And the last step is to dispatch action and update the UI. So in this step, we will dispatch the actions we have created, which will trigger the reducer to update the state. And the components will then use selectors to retrieve the updated state and reflect the changes in the UI. So with this, we have gone over the 6 steps for working with NgRx Store. Now let's put them into practice. Switching back to the Visual Studio Code Editor, and let's implement these steps in our counter example. First, inside state folder, let me create one more folder called counter, and we will use this counter folder for the counter feature. And as per our first step, I'll add a new file inside this counter folder called counter.action.ts. And inside this file, we will define and export actions using the create action function from the NgRx store. So first we will create an increment action. For that, I'll write export constant increment equals to, I'll use the function create action and make sure it will import from NgRx store. Now inside this create action function, we need to specify the action type as a string. So here inside single quotes, I'll write counter inside square bracket space increment. Okay. So inside this single quote, you can add anything related to increment action. But here I have added counter inside the square bracket and space increment. This indicates that the action belongs to the counter feature and is triggered when the user wants to increment the counter. Okay. Now I'll follow the same approach to create decrement and reset action. So here instead of increment, I'll write decrement. And here also instead of increment, I'll write decrement. In this case also, this decrement action belongs to the counter feature and it is triggered when the user wants to decrement the count. And last is for reset. Here I'll write reset the counter. Okay. So this is our first step, create action. Now the second step is to create the reducer. And for that, I'll again create a new file called counter.reducer.ts. And inside this file, first we should start by defining and exporting the initial state. So here I'll write export constant initial state equals to, I'll set 0 for our counter. Initially, I want to set my counter to 0. Now next, we will create a reducer function. For that, I'll again write export constant and name of the reducer function is counter reducer equals to. Now here I'll use the create reducer function from NgRx store. Make sure to import create reducer function from NgRx store. Remember, we need to define actions with create action function and reducer with create reducer function. Now this create reducer function takes the initial state as the first parameter. Here you can see initial state of type unknown and followed by one or more on functions from NgRx store that specifies how to handle specific actions. So here I'll write first parameter as the initial state, comma, and then on function, which is also imported from NgRx store. And inside this on function, we need to specify the action type. So our action type is increment, comma. Next, we need to add the handler function that updates the state. So inside bracket, I'll add state, arrow function, and state plus 1. So it means when this increment action is dispatched, this handler function will call the current state as an argument and returns a new state value by incrementing it to 1. After this, we can add comma and include additional on functions for decrement and reset. For decrement, I'll write state minus 1 and we need to import this decrement from the counter.action file. Similarly, I'll write for reset and for reset, I'll set the initial value that is 0. This also we need to import from the counter.action. Okay, reset action returns the initial value which is 0. So this is the code we have to write inside the reducer file for the counter functionality. And with that, we have completed the first 2 steps, creating actions and reducers. Now let's move on to the third step, registering the state in the appconfig.ts file. And this is an important step in setting up the store. So I'll open the appconfig.ts file, and here let's register the counter register in the same way we registered the EMP reducer using a key value pair, where the key represents the state name and the value is the corresponding reducer. So in this case, I'll write the key as a counter colon. Our reducer name is counter reducer. Let me paste the counter reducer here, and we need to import it from reducer file. Okay, so this is how we can register our reducer. And registering the reducer with provide store tells NgRx to create a store with the counter state and use the counter reducer to manage the counter state. So now we have created the state for the counter reducer. So we should see this counter state in the Redux DevTools. So let me go back to the Chrome browser, and here let me inspect this page. We need to navigate to the Redux DevTools, and here we can see the counter state under the state tab. Okay, so this is our third step. Now let's move on to the fourth step, using selectors to retrieve data from the store. So in the app.component.ts file, I'll comment out this counter variable, and I'll create a new observable counter variable of type observable number. And let me comment out this counter increment, decrement, and resetting. Okay. After this creating the observable variable, we need to inject the store through the constructor. So let me add constructor here, private store of type store, which is imported from NgRx store. And now here we need to specify the data type of the counter variable. So here we can specify any, but instead of using the any data type, we will define an interface for the store. So inside this counter folder, I'll create one more file called counter.store.ts. And I'll use this file for creating an interface. So here I'll export interface, and the interface name I'll write iCounter. Inside this interface, I'll define the variable counter of type number. Now, inside app.component.ts file, instead of using the any data type, I'll specify the interface name iCounter. And inside this constructor, I'll write this dot counter equals to, here I'll use the select method of the store. This dot store dot select, and inside this method we need to pass counter as an variable. So once you press the control plus space, it will show you suggestions. So I'll write counter. Okay. So with this, we have completed our fourth and fifth step, that is creating selector and defining an interface. Now the final step is to dispatch an action and update the UI. Inside on increment, on decrement, and on reset function, let's use the store dispatch method to call the respective action. So here this dot store dot dispatch, and inside this method we need to specify the action. So for increment we will use increment action. Okay. Similarly for decrement I'll use the decrement action, and for reset we need to use the reset action. So here instead of increment I'll write reset, which is imported from counter.action file. Here you can see the increment, decrement, and reset actions imported from counter.action file. Okay. Now last, we need to map this counter variable with template file. So for that, we can use async pipe or subscribe to the observable to get the latest state. So here inside imports array, I'll add the async pipe and use the same pipe to bind the counter variable with template file. So here instead of counter, I'll write counter dollar pipe symbol and async pipe. And with this, we have now completed all 6 steps of the implementation. let's revisit the browser and test the counter functionality for the app component. So here you can see I am clicking on the increment button. The app counter is incrementing by 1. And once I click on the decrement, it is decrementing by 1. Similarly, click on the reset button. It is resetting to 0. Here also you can see the counter state is updating as per the user interaction. Okay. So it confirms that our NgRx store implementation is working correctly. Now next, we have the user and admin component set. And we want to display this updated counter value in both component, user as well as admin component. And to do this, we can simply copy the counter variable and the constructor from this app.component.ts file and open the user component ts file as well as admin component ts file and paste the same code inside both the files. And don't forget to import the async pipe or other required dependencies. So let me import it quickly. iCounter, we need to import from counter.store.ts file, and here we need to import the async pipe. Okay, same I need to do inside the admin component. I'll open the class file of admin component and I'll paste the same counter variable and constructor. And here also I'll import the async pipe. Now next we need to bind this counter variable to the respective component template files. So let's copy this h2 from appcomponent.html file. And let me open the user component template file, and here I'll take one div with class text center, and inside this I'll paste the h2 element, and I'll update the counter. This is user component counter, so I'll update the app with user. And inside admin component template file, I'll paste the same HTML code and update the component name admin. Save the changes, and now let's test this in the browser. Let me click on the increment button, decrement, and reset. And we can see the updated counter value in all three components: app component, user component, and admin component. Okay, so let's quickly recap all 6 steps. Let me close all these files. And what we did in first step, we have created 3 actions inside counter.action.ts file: increment, decrement, and reset. And then we created a reducer and added the respective logic for all 3 actions. Next, we register the reducer inside app.config.ts file with key value pair. After that, we created an interface called iInterface for type safety. Then inside app.component.ts file, used this store select method. And after that, we dispatched the 3 actions using store dispatch method and bound this counter variable with the template file using the async pipe. And finally, we used a selector to display the updated counter values in the admin and user components. And this example demonstrates a parent-child component relationship. But by injecting the store in the constructor, we can access the updated counter value anywhere in the application. So the benefit of using NgRx is the state is stored in a single place, making it easier to manage. Hope you understand this counter example with NgRx. Now let's explore props in NgRx, also known as payloads. And to demonstrate this, we will continue with our counter example, walking through the same steps to see how props work in action. So first, I'll run this project using command ngs, and I'll open it in the browser. And let's start by understanding the scenario. So far, we have set the initial counter value to 0, which means the counter will start from 0. However, if you want to allow users to customize the starting value of the counter, then we will need to add an input field and a button to send the user input. And this will enable users to input their desired value, and the counter will increment or decrement accordingly when they click the respective buttons. So let's go ahead and implement this. So for this custom counter functionality, I'll create a new component called custom counter component. So here I'll use CLI command ng generate component name custom counter, and our custom counter component is created. Now I'll go inside app.component.html file, and below this existing buttons, I'll add a custom counter selector separated by an HR tag. So here inside div, I'll add app custom counter, and also I need to import the same component inside the imports array, not in the user component. Inside the app component, we need to import the custom counter component. Okay. And now if I revisit the browser, we can see the custom counter component on the UI. Now next, I'll open the custom counter component template file, and I'll add an input field and button. And since we are focusing on functionality, for now I'll keep the design simple using basic Bootstrap classes. So div dot text center, then div dot row, and div dot call well. Now here I'll take one input field with type number. Also I'll add the placeholder, add to counter, and then I'll add one button with class btn primary, btn small sm, and margin 2, and the button name is add counter. Okay. Also I'll add a click event with function add counter. Next we need to define this add counter function inside the class file of the same component, and also I'll declare one variable to store the custom counter value, and the variable name add counter value of type number. Okay. And to fetch the user's input, I'll bind this add counter value variable to the input field using two-way data binding. Inside the template file, here inside input box, I'll use banana in a box syntax with ng model equals to, I'll paste add counter value variable. And since this ng model is a part of forms module, we need to import it from the angular/forms package. Forms module from angular/forms. Okay. Now next, to verify the input is being captured correctly, I'll add console log inside this add counter function to print the user's input. I format the document and save the changes. Now I'll go back to browser and inspect this page, navigate to the console tab, and now when I type a number in this input field like 12 and click the add counter button, we can see the user's input logged in the console. And this completes the basic UI setup for our custom counter functionality. Okay, now let's implement the actual functionality of the custom counter example. And to do this, we need to send the user input to the main state counter, which will then update the counter values across all three components. So let's proceed step by step. First step is to create an action for the add counter button. So let me go inside counter.action.ts file, and let's define and export the new action called add custom counter using the create action function. And now this action function takes two parameters, the action type and the payload or props. So the action type will be counter for add custom counter, and it indicates that this add custom counter action belongs to the counter feature and is triggered when the user wants to add a custom counter value. And for the payload, we need to use the props function from RxJS store. And here we can pass an interface or define a payload structure directly. Like inside curly brackets, we need to write the structure. So for this example, I'll add value of type number and open and close round brackets. Okay. So we have created an add custom counter action for add counter functionality. Now let's go ahead and implement the logic for this functionality in the reducer file. So let me open the reducer file, and inside this file, we will add one more on function to handle the add custom counter action, which is imported from counter.action file. And here we need to pass the state and action, and it returns the new state value that's calculated by adding the current state value to action.add_value. This means we are adding the user's input value to the current counter state. This is our current counter state, and this is our user's input value. Okay. Now we have done with the action and reducer part. Now the next step is to register the reducer in the app.config.ts file using the key value pair. But we have already completed this step for the counter reducer. So let's move on with the next step, that is dispatch an action. And to do this, we will dispatch the add custom counter action from the custom counter component class file. So first we need to inject the store from NgRx store into the components constructor. So here inside constructor, I'll write private store :store, which is imported from NgRx store and which will allow us to use the dispatch method. And here when injecting the store, we can specify the data type or an interface. So for now, I'll pass an iCounter interface to the store. And now we can use the store.dispatch method to dispatch the add custom counter action. So inside this add counter function, I'll write this dot store dot dispatch, and inside this method, we need to specify the action, that is add custom counter. And this add custom counter action expects an add value property of type number. So we will pass the user's input value to it. That is, here we need to add value :add counter value. And we need to pass this inside the curly brackets. And one more thing, here we will use the unary operator, that is plus symbol, to convert the add counter value to a number, ensuring that the values are added correctly rather than concatenated. And that's it for this class file. And we have already written the necessary code inside the custom counter component template file. Now let's revisit the browser and test the functionality to see it in action. Now here, when I enter the number 10 and click the add counter button, the counter value updated to 10. And when I click the increment or decrement buttons, the counter value will update from the user entered number. And you can see the updated counter value in all three components: app component, user component, and admin component. Okay. Now, if I want to add the 10 number to this current counter value, so I need to click on this add counter, the 10 plus 8, 18. Okay. We have successfully demonstrated how to customize the counter value based on user inputs using NgRx. And by utilizing props in actions, we are able to pass dynamic values to the reducer, which then updates the state accordingly. Let me recap what we have done so far. So first we designed the UI for custom counter functionality. Then we created an action for add custom counter with props. Then we created a reducer for the newly created action. And finally, using the stores dispatch method, we dispatched the add custom counter action with a user input value. Now, in the same way, we can also remove counter values based on user input. So let's quickly implement this feature as well. And to do this, I'll update the UI to include remove counter input field and button. So here, let me update this column to 6 and this to 6. Let's update the variable name. Instead of add, I'll write remove counter variable, and let's define the same counter variable inside the class file of type number. And here, this exclamatory marks is the definite assignment assertion operator. It tells TypeScript that this property will definitely be initialized before it's used. Okay. And next, I'll update the placeholder remove from count. Then I'll update the function name, remove counter, We need to define the same function inside the class file, and here the button name is remove count. Okay, save the changes, and inside class file, let me define the function remove counter. So we have done the UI part for remove counter functionality. Now next, let's create a new action called remove custom counter and update its type to reflect the removal operation. Here, update this add with remove. And we will also rename the add value variable to remove value. Okay. Now let's update the reducer file by adding a new on function for remove custom counter action, which we need to import from counter.action file. Okay. And we need to modify the logic to subtract the value by using minus instead of plus, and update the variable name to remove value. Okay. Now last, let's switch to the custom counter component class file, and inside the remove counter function, let's dispatch the remove custom counter action using the store.dispatch method. Let me copy paste this line, and here we need to update the action, that is remove custom counter, and we need to pass remove value as remove counter value. Now save the changes and let's test this as well. Now this time I'll add 20 to this counter, add counter. The number 20 is added to the current counter, and then I wish to subtract 10 from the current counter value. So once I click on this remove counter button, we can see the updated counter value in all three components. That is 20 minus 10, 10. And now the counter can be increased or decreased as expected. It means everything seems to be working correctly. So far, we have covered all the NgRx topics that every Angular developer should know, except for NgRx effects. So if you go back to the NgRx pattern, we have understood the left portion of this diagram, which includes creating action, building reducers, using the store, and utilizing selectors in components. And this covers the core concepts of NgRx. Now we will shift our focus to the right side of the NgRx pattern, which is effects. And effects handles complex actions such as interacting with backend APIs through services. And a backend API enables communication between our application and a server. So to understand the NgRx effects concept thoroughly, we will build a complete CRUD application, create, read, update, delete using a JSON server. And this hands-on approach will help us to understand the full functionality of creating, reading, updating, and deleting entries. So in this section, we will implement routing and then set up a JSON server to build the fundamental for our CRUD application. So let me jump into the Visual Studio Code editor, and now we'll start from here. And one more thing, since we have covered these routing implementation and set up a JSON server in our Angular 19 series, I will quickly recap routing and JSON server here. But if you are new to Angular, I highly recommend checking out my comprehensive Angular 19 tutorial where I explain each concept in detail. So let's start. In our previous project, to avoid confusion, I have created a components folder and moved all components inside it. So now all components are organized within components folder. And while NgRx related files like actions, reducers, and store are allocated in the state folder. Under this state folder, I have created two folders, counter and EMP. Inside counter folder, you can find all the counter related action, reducer, and store files. And inside EMP folder, you can find all the employee related reducer and store files. Okay. Now next, since Angular is a component-based application, we will implement routing first, which will enable navigation between components. And after setting up routing, we will create a new JSON server from scratch to build CRUD operations. And I'll start design our page with a sample navbar at the top, featuring links to our counter example and CRUD operation. And to achieve this, we will create a new component called navbar. Ng generate component name navbar. And I'll add the selector of this navbar component inside app.component.html file at the top. And also I need to import the same component inside imports array of the app component class file. So here I'll import navbar component. Now save the changes, and if I open the browser, here you can see the navbar component is rendered in the browser. And since we have already installed Bootstrap, we will use a Bootstrap navbar. So here I'll search Bootstrap navbar and I'll click on this version 5.3, and then I'll copy this first example and paste it into our navbar component.html file. Okay. Then I'll make some modifications as per our need. I'll remove this selector, and then instead of navbar here I'll write NgRx. I'll remove this href hash. After that I'll delete this drop down. Also I'll delete this disable button, and I'll delete this form. And now here I'll update this link with name counter and the second link with CRUD. Now save the changes and have a look into the browser. Okay, I'll update the background color to secondary, and now it looks like a navbar. Now next I'll create a new component for a counter functionality, ngGenerate counter, and I'll move the counter related code from the app component to the counter component along with necessary imports. Okay, let me correct the command. I missed C for component. Okay, and then I'll go inside the app component.html file and accept this app navbar selector. I'll cut the code from here and paste it inside the counter component. Similarly, I'll copy the class related code from this app component.ts file, cut, then inside counter class file, I'll paste. Also, I need to import all missing imports. So I'll click on add all missing imports, and then I'll again go back to the app component class file, and I'll cut the component from this imports array except navbar component. Paste all these components inside the imports array of counter component with the import statements. And now I'll add the counter component selector inside this app component. And if I save the changes, you can see, okay, I need to import the counter component inside the imports array. Okay, now save the changes. And if I refresh the page, you can see the navbar, and below navbar, we can see the counter component. I'll change the heading counter example. Okay. So like this, we have created two separate component, navbar and counter, and added these two components inside the app component.html file. But in future, we will create additional components for CRUD operations. So instead of adding all these components to this app.component.html file, we will implement route. So this will allow us to use the router outlet directive, which will render the components dynamically based on the route. And when creating our project, we opted for routing, which generated the app.routes.ts file. And this file contains an empty array of type routes. So let's configure the routes here. A route is an object that consists of two parameters. The first parameter is a path and the second parameter is a component. So this first path parameter, which is a URL path for your component, it can be any name. For example, I'll write counter for our counter component, which we need to provide inside the single quotes. Okay. And the second parameter is component, which specifies which component to render when this path is accessed. So here we need to provide the component class name. So for the path counter, I will provide the counter component. Okay. So what is route? A route is an object, and within that object, we have two parameters, path and component. The path refers to the link for your component, and component parameter specifies which component to render when this path is accessed. So in this case, when a user accesses the counter path, it means they want to be redirected to the counter component. Therefore, in the same way, we can add multiple route object as needed, separated by comma. So I'll add one more route for CRUD operation. So path will be CRUD and component will be CRUD component. Okay. Before that, I need to create one more component called CRUD component. Ng generate component CRUD, and CRUD component has been created. Now I can import this CRUD component here. Okay, so this is how we have added two routes inside this routes array. Also, I'll add a default route that will render when we load the application. And for the default route, the path will be empty and the component will be the one on which you wish to render your application. And since we are continuing working with CRUD operation, I wish to render my application on CRUD component. So here I'll provide CRUD component, but you can provide a login or dashboard component as per the requirement. So this is how we can configure the routes in Angular application. And now the important step is we need to add the router outlet directive where the router will render the component associated with the current route. So I'll add the router outlet directive below the navbar component selector because we need the navbar on every page. And it's mandatory to import the router outlet inside the imports array of same component. So here I'll import the router outlet. And now I can delete this app counter selector from here because we have already added the route for counter inside the app.routes.ts file. Okay. Now when I refresh the browser, you can see our application is by default rendered on CRUD component. Because in the default route, we have provided the component name CRUD component. But here, if I type counter and hit enter, it renders the counter component along with the navbar. And similarly, if I type CRUD, it renders the CRUD component. And this demonstrates routing between component via URL. However, for easy access, we want to achieve the same redirection when a navbar link is clicked. And if I open the navbar component HTML file, we can see currently navbar template uses the href attribute, which causes a full page reload for every redirection. And it's not ideal for an Angular application as it's designed for building single page application that dynamically update content without full page reload. So to do this, we will use a router link directive instead of this href because router link directive enables seamless navigation between components without page reload. So let's use the router link directive with a lowercase r and an uppercase L. Router link equals to, here we will provide the same path of the respective component that we configured in the routes array here. And as we have learned in the Angular 19 series, there are four ways to use the router link directive. First way is like this: inside double quotes, we can pass the route path. And the second way is we can use path name with forward slash like this. And third, we can use property binding where we bind the path name as a string like this. So we need to wrap this router link inside square bracket and this counter path inside single quote. This is the third way. And the fourth way is we can wrap this counter inside square bracket so that it allows us to add the ID, name, or status in future separated by comma. Okay. So by using this router link, we will enable seamless navigation between components without page reload. Okay, so I'll copy the same router link directive from here and paste it for the CRUD operation as well. And for CRUD component, we need to provide the path CRUD. Okay, now save the changes and okay, one more thing. Before we test this in the browser, we need to import this router link into the imports array. So let me go inside the class file and import router link. Now save the changes and now we can test. Now I'll click on this counter link and we can smoothly render this counter component. If I click on the CRUD, we can render on the CRUD component without page reload. And notice that the URL changes without page reload when I click on the counter component. I'm redirecting to the counter component seamlessly. Similarly, clicking on the other links doesn't trigger a page refresh, indicating that our router link directive is working correctly. And one more thing, To highlight the active link on the navbar, we can use router link active directive. And this directive dynamically adds CSS classes to an element when its link route is active. And to do this, we need to first import the router link active directive inside the imports array. And then in the HTML file, we will assign the active class to the directive using router link active directive. So here I'll write router link active equals to, I'll assign the class active. Same I'll paste for CRUD component. And now this will apply the styles defined in the active class when the corresponding route is active. So let's quickly add CSS for this active class. Let me go inside the CSS file of this navbar component to define the appearance of the active link. So here I'll write active, and inside this active class I'll provide font weight bold and font style equals to italic. Okay, save the changes. And if I revisit the browser, we can see by default we land on the CRUD component. That is why we can see this CRUD in bold. Now if I navigate to the counter component, then this counter component is in bold. So by doing this, user can easily understand currently he is under which component. Okay. And with this, we have successfully implemented routing through URL as well as link clicks without page reload. Okay. Now, next thing we need for our CRUD operation is setting up a JSON server. But for CRUD operation, we could use a dummy API like JSON placeholder. If we go inside this first link, so we can work with this API user to do photo album, etc. However, since we want to perform all CRUD operations, I'll choose a JSON server for this purpose. And with JSON server, we can create our own API and update the data as needed, making it easier to understand the process. So let's set up our JSON server with a similar data to this to-dos API, like user ID, title, and completed. Okay. So first, let's understand what steps are required in order to set up the JSON server. And this process involves three steps. First step is we will install JSON server using the command npm install -g JSON server @0. And this @0 flag ensures that we install the stable version, which automatically generates IDs in integer format when adding new data to the database. Second, we will create a JSON file, that is db.json, to serve as the data source. And third step is we will run the JSON server using command JSON-server --watch JSON file name. In this case, db.json. And by following these three steps, we can set up the JSON server and create a mock backend API. Now let's do it practically. Let me go back to Visual Studio Code Editor, and here I'll open a new terminal. And as per the first step, let's run the command npm install -g JSON-server @0. And note that installing without @0 flag might generate ID in hexadecimal format instead of integers. And we are installing JSON server globally. If you have already installed it, you can check the version using command JSON-server -v. And if not, simply run this command npm install -g JSON-server @0. Now next, in the second step, we will create a new file with .json extension at root level. And here I'll create a new file called db.json. Let me move this file outside to this src folder. And now we will add a sample data to this file, including an array called to-dos with individual to-do objects. Okay, let me copy the object from this to-do API, user ID, title, and completed. And now I'll update this object with title NgRx tutorial with ID 1. Now I'll add few more objects here. So I'll copy the same object and paste it for 3 more times. I'll update the ID with 2 and title will be Angular tutorial. I'll update with RxJS. Fourth, I'll update with TypeScript. Okay. So with this, we have completed our first two steps, that is installation of JSON server and created the db.json file with dummy data. Now let's go ahead with the third step, that is running the JSON server. So let me open the terminal again. Let me clear this console. And now to start the JSON server, we need to use the command json-server-watch and file name, that is db.json, and hit enter. And this will start the JSON server and provide us with API endpoints such as this http localhost colon 3000 slash todos. And notice that the endpoint includes the name of the array we created in the db.json file, which is todos. And navigating to this URL in our browser, it displays the data we added to the db.json file. And this confirms that we set up our JSON server with the functional API endpoint and data, effectively creating a mock backend API. And this approach is perfect for practicing CRUD operations without relying on a real API. Okay, so with this, we have completed the routing implementation as well as configured a JSON server, effectively preparing a base for CRUD operations. Now, before diving into directly CRUD operations, I wish to cover the concept of NgRx effects. And then, as a practice exercise, we will apply the entire NgRx pattern, including the store and effects, to implement CRUD operations. Okay, so why do we need NgRx effect? We need NgRx effects to handle external interactions such as API calls, keeping our application's core logic clean and organized. And in this section, we will integrate the JSON placeholder REST API and display its data using NgRx effect. So to work with NgRx effect, we first need to install the NgRx effect library, and which we have already done during environment setup using the command ng-add or npm install @ngrx/effects. And this command adds the NgRx effects package to our project's node module. If you navigate to the node module folder, here you will find the NgRx folder, and within that folder, you can find the effects folder, which contains the NgRx effect library files. Okay, so we have set up the NgRx effects library. Now let's proceed step by step. And typically, our first step would be to create an action, but you can adjust your approach for convenience. So here, before creating an actions, we will define an interface that matches the API data structure. So I'll open the JSON placeholder URL to examine the API data. And we will use the todos API. So I'll go inside this endpoint. I'll copy these four properties, user ID, title, completed, and paste them into our interface file. And to organize our to-do related files, I'll create a new folder called to-dos under the state folder. And within that folder, I'll create an interface file named todos.store.ts. Now here, I'll export interface name I2do. And inside curly brackets, I'll paste all four properties. And quickly, I'll remove these double quotes. And instead of value, I'll add the data types. Username number, ID also number, title should be string, and completed should be boolean. Now next, I'll create three more files under the same to-do folder. The first is todos.actions.ts for defining actions. Next is todos.reducer.ts for handling state changes. And last, todos.effects.ts for managing side effects. Now let's start by creating actions. And we will need at least two actions. First is load todos to initialize the loading process. And second is load todos success to handle the successful retrieval of todos. And third action, load todos failure can be added to handle any potential errors. But for now, we will focus on implementing first two actions. And once you understand this, you can add the load to do's failure action as well. Okay, so let's add the first action. Export const load to do's equals to, we can create action by using the create action function. Create action, and inside round brackets, we need to mention the type. So this action is for to do. So I'll write to do inside square brackets, and then I'll write load to do's. Okay, so this is our first action. Now, second action is load to do success. So here also I'll write export const load to do success equals to create action, and again inside round brackets I'll add the type to do load to do success, because this action is for to do success. And here I'll pass the props along with type. So props and then triangular bracket, and inside curly brackets we need to pass the store name. So I'll add store name to do's of type I to do. This is our interface name, and then array symbol. Okay. So after triangular bracket, we need to add the round brackets as well. Just I'll format this structure. Okay. So we have created two actions. One is load to do's and another is load to do success. And inside this load to do success, we are passing the props. This to do's is a store name, and this I to do is our interface name. Now let's create the reducer logic in todo.reducers.ts file to handle the load to do's and load to do success actions. And here we will define the initial state and update it accordingly based on actions. So first, let's define the shape of the state for the to do feature. Export interface I to do state. And it has a single property called to do's, which is an array of I to do's object. So here I'll add interface with array symbol. Next, we need to set the initial state for the to do feature. So here export const initial state of type this I to do state, and when the app starts, the to do's array is empty. So here I'll add to do's colon empty array. Okay. Now next, let's create a reducer function to manage the to do state. And we can create reducer using create reducer function. So here I'll write export const reducer name to do reducer equals to create reducer, and the create reducer function takes the initial state and a list of on handlers and returns a new state. So we have two handlers. So I'll add two on function. One is for load to do's action, state arrow symbol state, and another on function is for load to do success action, comma state. Here we need to pass the props, so to do's and then arrow symbol, and inside curly brackets we will use spread operator state comma to do's. Okay, so this state should be inside brackets, and we need to import this on function from NgRx store. Okay, we have added first on function for load to do's action. When load to do's is dispatched, the state remains unchanged. And when load to do success is dispatched with a payload of to do's, the state is updated by replacing the existing to do's array with a new one. So here we define the state structure. Next, we set the initial state and created a reducer to handle two actions, load to do and load to do success. Now next, after setting up the interface, actions and reducers, we will create a new service to integrate the REST API using the HTTP client package. And to generate a service, I'll run the command ngGenerate service services slash to do and enter. which will create a new folder called services with the to-do service files inside. Here you can see inside services, there are two files, todo.service.ts and todo.service.spec.ts. So I'll navigate to the todo.service.ts file, and now I'll quickly integrate the to-dos API. So first I'll copy this URL and store it in one variable. Private base URL equals to inside single quotes, I'll paste the REST API URL. And after that, I'll inject the HTTP client through constructor private HTTP:/HTTP client. And when working with HTTP client, make sure to add provide HTTP client to the providers array in app.config.ts file. So here I'll add provide HTTP client. Okay, don't forget this step. Now let me go back to the service file, and after this constructor, I'll create a method called getToDos of type observable of type our interface name I2Do. And then this method will return this.http.get of type I2Do, and inside round brackets we'll pass the base URL this.base URL. Since this is the function, we need to add the round brackets. Okay. So now this getToDos method is holding all the data coming from this todos REST API. And in order to display the API data on the web, we need to create an effect. So our next step is to create an effect. This effect will fetch the data and trigger an action to update the state. So now I'll go inside the todos.effect.ts file, and here we need to add the Angular @injectable decorator that allows a class to be injected with dependencies. So here I'll write export class to do effects, and this class is injectable and has two dependencies. One is actions and another is to do service. So first I'll write actions is an observable of NgRx actions injected via the actions type. Inject actions. Now second, we need to inject the to do service. So I'll inject this through constructor private to do service of type to do service. Okay, so this to do service is a service for interacting with the to do API, and we have injected through the constructor. And here I noticed that if you register the action through the constructor, the actions might be undefined because the actions could be triggered before the constructor is called. So in such a case, it's better to inject or register the action using the inject function. Okay, so we have the class definition and dependencies. Now let's define the effect, and we will create an effect using the create effect function. So here I'll declare one variable called load to dos with dollar symbol. My caps lock was on. Load to dos equals to create effect function, and then we need to use the fat arrow syntax. And inside this, we will call the actions dot pipe, and then we will utilize the of type function from RxJS effect packages. And here we need to pass the action name as a parameter to filter the action. So our action name is load actions dot load to dos, and we need to import the to do actions. So here let me import star as to do actions from to dos dot action. Now after that, we will use the merge map RxJS operator. Remember, here we will use the pipe method, and then we will combine merge map and map RxJS operators. With merge map, we will trigger the API call. So here I'll use again the arrow function, and I'll call the get to dos method from to do service. So to do service dot get to dos, and then I'll use pipe method and use map operator to handle the response. So here inside map, I'll pass the to dos of type I to do square brackets and then arrow symbol, and then we will need to call the load to do success. I'll call this from to do actions dot load to do success. And here we need to pass the props, that is to do's. Okay. Here we are getting an error. Observable unknown is not assignable to the type. I'll check the brackets. Okay, we need to import the map with merge map from RxJS library. Yeah. Now we are getting the error on line number 19. Argument of type operator function I to do is not assignable to parameter of type I to do. Okay, let me check this get to do method. Okay, here I missed to add the square brackets. Since this is array, we need to add the square brackets. Yeah, now no errors. Okay, so this code creates an NgRx effect. First, it listens the load to do's action, then it triggers an API call to load to do's, and on success, dispatches load to do success action with loaded to do's. Now, after creating an effect, we need to register the to do reducer and to do effects in the app.config.ps file. And we can register the reducer through provide store function. So here I'll add comma, and then we need to add the store name, that is to do's colon to do reducer. And next we can register the to do effect through provide effects function. So inside this round bracket, I'll add the square brackets and write to do effects. And here also we can register multiple effects in provide effects function by separating them with commas. And this provide effects function is automatically added when you install the NgRx Effects library. So to register the effect, we just need to add the effect name inside the provide effects array. That's it. Okay. So with this, we have completed this step by registering the to do reducer and to do effects. Now finally, we need to dispatch the action from the component using a selector. And earlier we have written the selector code directly in the component class file. But we can also create a separate file for selectors similar to actions, effects, and reducers. So this time, let's create a separate file for selector called todos.selector.ts to keep our code organized. And here, first we will create a feature selector with name select todos state using the create feature selector function, which will select the entire to-do state of type I to-do state from the global state. So inside this I to-do state, we can find only one property, that is I to-dos. So here I'll add I to-do and we need to export it. Export const select to-do state. Okay. Now next we will create another selector with name select to-do. Export const select to-dos equals to, now we will use the create selector function to create the selector. Create selector, which will utilize the select to-do state to extract and return the to-dos array from the to-do state. So here I'll add state arrow function and then state.todos. So this select to-do state select the entire to-do state, and this select to-dos selects the to-dos array from the to-do state. Okay, so we have the separate selector file. Now we can dispatch the load to-dos action from any component. So now I'll create a new component called effects using command ngGenerate components slash effects. This command will add the component to the components folder. So here you can see the effects component under the components folder. Now to see the effect component on web, I'll add the routes in app.routes.ts file. So here I'll add one more route for effects. This route is for effect component. And also I'll update the Nava component template file by including one more link for this effect component. Here I'll add effects and the link name should be effects. Save the changes, and if I navigate to the browser, we can see the effect component. Okay, now let's go inside the effect component PS file, and here we will dispatch the load to do's action. And to dispatch the action, we will need to inject the RxJS store into our component. Here I'll inject store through inject function. So store equals to inject, and inside bracket we need to write store from RxJS store. Now here I'll declare one property called to-do's data. This is observable properties, so I'll use the dollar symbol equals to. Here we need to use the select method to retrieve the to-do's data from the store. So this dot store dot select, and then we need to utilize the select to-do selector. After that, we will use the NgOnInit lifecycle hook to dispatch the load to-do's action when the component initialized. So here we need to implement the onInit first, and then we need to define that NgOnInit lifecycle hook. Now here I'll write this dot store dot dispatch. Inside the round brackets, we need to pass the action, and the action name is load to do's. So this action triggers the effect that loads the to do's data from the API. So inside effect, you can see this load to do's action will call this API, and on success, it will dispatch the load to do success action with loaded to do's. Now next, to display the API data in the UI, we will use the async pipe to subscribe to this to-do's data observable. So first I need to import the async pipe, and then inside effect.component.html file, I'll take one UL tag, and inside that I'll use the @for control flow syntax to iterate over the data. So here I'll copy this property to do data, and we will write here data of to do's data pipe async semicolon track dollar index, and then I'll take one li. Inside that li, I'll add the heading inside bold tag id colon inside double curly brackets I'll write data.id, and same I'll do for title and completed data.title and data.completed. And with this, everything is set up. Now let's test the application. And when we navigate to the effects component in the browser, we can see the to-do's API data successfully rendered on the web page, fetched using NgRx Effects. You can see all the data. You can verify this ID equals to 200, and here also the last object with ID 200. Okay, so now we can display the same data in different component. Like we have created a CRUD component, we can simply copy paste the template and class file code of this effect component. So let me quickly do that. I'll copy this code from here, and let me open the CRUD component class file, and I'll paste it here. And don't forget to import the necessary imports. So I'll add all imports, all missing imports, and also I'll import the async pipe. Now I'll copy the HTML code from the effect component, and I'll paste the same code inside CRUD component template file. Save the changes, and when we navigate to the CRUD component, we can see the same to-do's API data. Okay, so we have rendered this to-do's API data inside CRUD component as well as effects component. And this demonstrates the power of NgRx in managing global state, allowing us to access and display the same data across multiple components in our application. So let's recap everything quickly. Let me close all files. And we started by creating an interface called iToDo, followed by actions for load to do's and load to do success. Then we created reducers to handle these actions. Next, we developed a service for API integration and created an effect that calls a service to fetch data when the to-do's action is dispatched. After that, we register the reducer and effects in app.config.ts file. We then created a selectors to retrieve to-do's data from the store. And finally, we dispatched the load to-do's action from effects and CRUD component and used the async pipe to display the data in the UI. So with this example, I assume that we have now gained a solid understanding of NgRx store and NgRx effects. Till now, we have covered all the key concepts of NgRx. So let's put our knowledge into practice by building a complete CRUD application using NgRx and JSON server. And in the last section, we have already set up the JSON server, but in this section, let's do a quick recap. So setting up JSON server involves three main steps. First step is we need to install JSON server using the command npm install -g JSON server @0. And as I mentioned earlier, this @0 flag ensures that we install the stable version, which automatically generates IDs in integer format when adding new data to the database. Then second step is we need to create a JSON file with dummy data, that is db.json. And last, we need to run the JSON server using the command JSON-server-watch db.json. And once the server starts, we can see the db.json data at URL localhost 3000. We'll see that later. Now, building on our previous work, in the last session, we integrated the to-dos API from JSON placeholder. And since this is a public API, we can't update it. So for CRUD operations, we will create our own REST API using JSON server for create, update, and delete operations. And by following these three steps, we have already configured a JSON server and mock backend API. So now I'll open Visual Studio Code Editor, and inside db.json file, we have added the to-dos API properties from JSON placeholder, such as user ID, title, and completed. But for now, I'll keep only two properties, ID and title. So let me delete the user ID and completed property from each object. Okay. And now I'll start this JSON server by hitting the command JSON-server space --watch space db.json. This is our file name. Enter. We're getting an error, expected double quote property name. Okay. Here also we can see the error in db.json. I missed to remove this comma. Now save the changes and rerun the same command. And now our JSON server is running on localhost 3000/todos. So if you navigate to this URL, you can see the db.json data here. We have added 4 objects in the db.json file. That is why we can see only 4 objects here. Now, to render this data on the web, we need to update the REST API in the service file. So let me navigate to the service file. Inside src, we have created a service folder, and inside that we have created the todo.service file. And remember, for this CRUD example, I am updating the same db.json and todo.service file. I'm not creating new ones. So inside this service file, I will copy paste the same code and comment out the first one. Now here, instead of using this JSON placeholder API, I will add a dummy JSON server API, which is localhost 3000/todos. Now, before saving these changes, let me show you what data was coming from the JSON placeholder API. This data we have rendered in the last session from JSON placeholder. But now once I update this API with the JSON server, we can see only 4 datas on the browser. Here you can see only 4 IDs. Okay, so it means our JSON server is up to date, and also we have rendered the same data on the UI. But now we will display the same data on the UI using a Bootstrap table so that we can do the create, update, and delete operation on top of that table. Let's create a simple Bootstrap table in crud.component.html file. So here
Let me delete all this code and I'll add one div with class container. Inside this div, I'll add h2 tag with class margin 4 and text center. And the heading is NgRx CRUD operations. Now after that, I'll take one table with class table dot table dark and table center. After that, t head with class bg secondary, and then inside this t head I'll add th with class call 3 and padding 2, and this table heading for id. I'll copy paste this 3 more times. Second is for title, third is for update, and fourth is for delete. After that, I'll add t body, and then inside tr I'll add td. Here we will use ng for directive or at the rate for control flow syntax to render the table data. So this first div is for id, second div is for title, and inside third div I'll add one button with class btn small, btn primary, and margin 1. This button is for update. And for this button, I'll add one click event and the function will be updated. And the same function I'll define in the TS file of the same CRUD component. So here after this ng on init, I'll define the updated function. Now inside HTML file, I'll copy paste the same button in fourth table data. And I'll update this button with delete. And the function will be delete data. Yes, you should be small. Now I'll define the same delete data method inside the TS file. Okay. Here I'll change the button color to danger. Now save the changes and let's have a look into the browser. Let me click on the CRUD component and here we can see the basic bootstrap table with dummy data, ID, title along with two buttons, update and delete. Now, below this table, let me add one PR tag and let's create one more button to create or add new data. For that, I'll add one more div and after that, I'll add the button dot btn success dot btn small and margin 1. And this button is for create new data. And I'll add the function for this button is create data. We'll add click event and then create data function. Let me define the same function inside the class file of CRUD component. And once I click on this create button, I want to show an input box to add a new data. So after this button, I'll add one input box with type text and class margin top 3. Here I'll add placeholder, add new title, and I'll give name equals to new data. And I'll create a new variable new data equals to empty string. And I'll bind this variable with the input box using the ng model syntax, that is banana in a box. Ng model equals to new data. And after this input box, I'll add one more button dot btn small dot btn warning and margin 1. This button is for add new data. Here also I'll add a click event. The function name is add date. Let's define the same function inside the TS file and I'll pass this new data variable to the add data function as a parameter. Save the changes and here also we need to pass the parameter data of type any. Okay. Save the changes and we are using the ng model. So we need to import the common module inside this imports array. Okay. Now save the changes and let's have a look at the browser. Okay, can't bind ng model since it's not. For ng model, we need to import the forms model, not a common model. Now save the changes and refresh the page. Now we can see the create button along with an input box and a add button. But I wish to visible this input box and add button only if the user clicks on this create button. So to achieve this, I will use an if condition with a variable is create. So let me create here one more variable is create of type boolean. Let me add the exclamatory marks. Now I'll use the if control flow syntax here. After this button, if, and inside that I'll pass is create variable. If it is true, then only display this input box and add button. Okay. And inside this create data method, I'll write is create equals to true. That means initially is create variable is false, and once you click on this create button, then only this portion will get visible. Now let's test this as well. Let me click on this create button. The input box is not visible. Let me see the error. Head plus ng secondary. Okay, let me use CR, and inside this TR, I'll move alt th. Now save the changes and let me refresh this page. And now I'll click on create button. Yes. Once I click on this create button, then only we can see the input text box along with add button. Okay. If I refresh the page, on page load, we don't need the input box and add button. If you want to add new data, then only we can click on this create button. Okay. So this is our basic bootstrap table, and it means we are ready with the UI. Now let's go step by step. And our first step is to create actions for CRUD operations. So I'll close all these files, and under the state folder, I'll create one more folder called CRUD. And inside this folder, I'll create new file for actions, crud.actions.ps. And inside this file, we will need 4 actions. One to load the REST API data, one to create new data, and one to update data, and last to delete it. After that, for each of these 4 actions, we will create 2 additional actions, one for success and one for failure. This will give us a total 12 actions. 3 for load, 3 for create, 3 for update, and 3 for delete. Okay. So let's start by creating a first action. Export const load CRUD data equals to create action. We can create action using create action function. And inside this, we can add the description of action. We have created the to-dos array inside db.json. So here I'll write to-do space load to-dos. Okay. And here also, instead of load CRUD data, I'll write the name load CRUD to-dos. So this is for our first action, that is load action. Now we are creating the action for load success. Export const load CRUD to-dos success equals to create action, and inside round bracket again I'll write to do space load to do success. And for success we need to pass the props. Props means payload. So here I'll write props, and inside triangular bracket we need to add the curly brackets, and here I'll pass to do's of type any. Now this time I'll go with any type. We will not create an interface. We will go with any type. Okay. So this is for success. Now I'll copy paste the same action for failure, and I'll update the action name with failure. Again, this action is for load to do failure, and inside this props I'll write error of type any. So this action is for our load to do's, This action is for load to do success and this action is for load to do failure. For success, we are sending the props to do and for failure, we are sending the props error. So till now, we have created 3 actions out of 12. So I will pause the video and write the remaining 9 actions similar to this. Okay. So here I have added 9 more action. For creating a to-do, we will pass props with the to-do data. Next, for updating data, we will pass props with the ID and to-do. And last, for deleting data, we will pass only the ID as a props. Okay, now let's move on to the second step, that is creating reducers using on functions. So let me create a separate file for reducer. Under this CRUD folder, I'll create one more file called crud.reducers.ts. And here, first we will define an interface called to-do state. So export interface to-do state. And this interface has only one property, to-dos, which is an array of type any. This means this to-do property can hold any type of data, for example, string, numbers, objects, etc. Now next, we will initialize the state. For that, here we will create a constant called initial state. So export const initial state of type to-do state equals to curly brackets. And now again, this initial state object has one property called to-dos, which is initialized as an empty array. After this initial state, now we will create a reducer function called to-do reducer using the create reducer function from NgRx. So here, constant to-do reducer equals to create reducer, and inside the round brackets, first we need to pass the initial state, which defines the initial state of the reducer. And the reducers handle 4 success actions. I'll update these load actions without CRUD. Okay. So after this initial state, I'll add first on function for load to do success. After that, comma state colon to do state comma to do's, and then fat arrow function, and inside round bracket we need to write the curly brackets and then initial state comma to do's. Okay, we need to import the on function from NgRx. Okay, so here we are getting an error on this to do's. Let me check this load to do success. Okay, here I forgot to add the round braces. Now save the changes and now no error. Okay. So this line of code indicates that when this load to do's action is dispatched, the reducer updates the state by replacing the to do's array with the new array of to do's received in the action payload here. Okay. Now similarly, I'll add the another on function for create to do success. Okay, and here I'll pass to do, and after this to do's, I'll add one array with state dot to do's comma to do. That means when this create to do success action is dispatched, the reducer adds the new to do item to the end of the existing to do's array. Okay. Now next on function I'll add for update to do success. Okay. And here I'll update this array with state dot to do's dot map, and inside round brackets t arrow function t dot id triple equals to do dot id, and then I'll add question mark and to do colon t. Okay. So this line number 16 means when the update to do success action is dispatched, the reducer updates the to do item with the matching ID in the to do's array. Now last, I'll write on function for delete to do success. And here instead of to do, we have sent the ID as a props. And here I'll write the filter instead of map. So inside filter, we will write t equals to t dot id is not equal to id.
It means when the delete to do success action is dispatched, the reducer removes the to do item with the matching ID from the to do array. Okay, so this is how we have written for success method inside the to do reducer. Now after that, we need to export the function called reducer of type to do state. And that reducer function calls this to do reducer. So let's write that code. Export const reducer, and inside bracket it takes the current state and an action as a arguments and returns the new state. So here I'll add the type to do state. So inside round brackets we need to pass the state equals to initial state and action of type action. And this will import from NgRx store. Now inside this function we need to write return to do reducer. Inside bracket we need to pass state comma action. Here we are getting an error. Okay, this reducer is a function, not a variable. Okay, so that was my bad. We need to write export function reducer. Okay, so what we did so far, inside reducer file, we have created an interface called to do state. After that, we have created the initial state. And after that, we have written for on function for success. And then we have exported the reducer function and returned the to do reducer inside that reducer function. Okay. So far we have completed writing actions and reducers. Now let's move on to the service file and implement the necessary HTTP methods like get, post, put, and delete. So let me open the to-do service file, and inside this to-do service.ts file, we have already updated this base URL, and inside this get to-dos method, we are calling the same base URL. So we have done with the HTTP get method. Now let's write the post method with payload to do. So here I'll write the method name post to do's and I'll pass to do as a payload of type any. And inside this method I'll return http dot post, and inside bracket I'll pass the base URL along with payload comma to do. Similarly, I'll write the update method. For update we will use http put method, and for update we will pass id and to do as a payload, id of type number and to do of type any. So here also inside this put method I'll use backtick then dollar, inside curly brackets we need to pass the base url slash dollar id comma to do. Okay, now last I'll write the delete method, delete to do's, and I'll pass the ID as a payload, ID of type number. And inside this method, I'll write return http dot delete, and inside round bracket, I'll pass this same base URL slash ID. And with this, we have completed the service code as well. We have written the get method, post method, put method, and delete method. Now next we will implement the effects. And to do this, we need to create the another file under the CRUD folder similar to this actions and reducer. So let me create the file crud.effects.yes. And inside this effect, I'll write at the rate inject table, and then I'll export class to do effects. And inside this class, first I'll inject the NgRx actions and store using the inject method. Okay, so action dollar equals to inject actions from NgRx effect. And then I'll inject the store. Private store equals to, here also I'll use the inject method, and inside inject I'll write store, which is imported from NgRx store. And after that I'll use constructor, and inside this constructor I'll inject the to do service. So private to do service of type to do service. Okay, I have injected the store and action using inject method and injected to do service through the constructor. Now let's create an effect. And how we can create effect? We can create effect using create effect function. So let's create a new effect
called load to dos with dollar symbol equals to create effects. And inside this effect function, I'll use part arrow syntax. And then this effect listens to the actions observable that emits actions dispatched in the application. So here I'll write this dot actions, and next I'll use the pipe operator, and now I'll filter the actions using the of type operator with the respective action name. So here I'll write of type, and inside this type, first I will write effect for load to do's action. So here I'll add load to do's and then comma. Now here, when this action is triggered, it calls the get to do's method from the to do service, right? So to handle the asynchronous response from the service, we will use merge map. After this of type, here I'll use merge map. And inside this, again, we will use the fat arrow function. Then we will fetch the service method. So our service name is to do service dot get to do's. And here again, we will use the pipe operator. And then we have to handle the response using the map operator. So I'll write map and then to do's, again fat arrow function. And here we need to call the load to do success action, because if this service call is success, the response is mapped to the load to do success action. So here I'll write load to do success, and we need to pass the payload. So here I'll write to do's. Similarly, if this service is fails, the error is caught and mapped to the load to do failure action. So after this, I'll write catch error, and inside this, I'll write error fat arrow function, and inside of we'll call the load to do's failure action. And here also we need to pass the error as a payload. We need to import this off from RxJS and this map also from RxJS. So with this, we have written first effect for load to do's action. So just to recap what we did here, first we listened to an action, then we called the respective service method from the service, which is get to do's. And if the response is successful, we dispatched the success action with the response data. Finally, if the service calls fails, we dispatched the failure action with the error. Okay. So that is our first effect for loading data. Now I'll pause the video and write the remaining 3 effects for creating, updating and deleting. So here after this load to do's effect, I have added 3 more effects. Second effect is for creating a new to do with a payload of to do. Third effect is for updating a to do with a payload of ID and to do. And the fourth effect is for deleting a to do with the payload of ID. And all these 3 methods, I have dispatched the load to do's method inside this map, so that after every change, the page should reload the original to do list. Okay. So with this, we have completed the effect file code as well. Now, next step is to register the reducer and effects in the app.config.ts file. So I'll open app.config.ts, and here you can see we have already registered the to-do reducer and to-do effects in the previous section while understanding the concept of NgRx effects. However, since the names are the same, I'll update the import statement to use reducer and effects from the CRUD folder instead of to-do folder. Or else here I'll write to-do effects and automatically it will get imported. Similarly, here I'll update from CRUD component, and this is CRUD.reducer. Okay, let me see. So here we have exported one function reducer, and inside that we have written to do reducer. So instead of that, we can directly export this to do reducer from here as well, or else we have to import this reducer. Okay, now no error. We have registered the to do reducer as well as to do effects inside the app.config.ts file. Now next step is to create a select. So for that, under the CRUD folder, I'll create CRUD.selector.ts file similar to action reducer and effects. CRUD dot selector dot ts.
And why we need a selector file? Because it extracts a specific piece of data from the NgRx store. And in this case, we are creating two selectors. One is select state and another is select tools. Okay. So inside this file, I'll write export const. First selector is select to do state equals to. This selector takes the entire state object as an argument and return the to-dos property from it. So here I'll write state of type any and then arrow symbol state.todos. Now after this I'll use the create selector method to create new select. Export const select todos equals to create selector method from NgRx store. And inside this method, the first argument is the select to do state select, which extracts the to do properties from the state object. And the second argument is fat arrow function that takes the result of the select to do state and returns the to do property again, state dot to do's. Okay. First argument is the select to do state and second argument is the fat arrow function. In this state, extract the to-do properties from the state object and here take the result from this select to-do state and returns the to-do property. Okay, so only this code we need to add inside the selector. Now the last step is to dispatch the actions from the CRUD component. So let me open the CRUD component.ts file. And here, first I'll create an observable variable to store the select to-dos data. This line of code we have written in the last session while understanding the effect concept. So now I'm writing the similar code. I'll create new observable variable called CRUD data with dollar symbol of type observable and inside triangular bracket, I'll write type any. Now inside NgOnInit method, I'll use the store select method. So this CRUD data equals to store dot select and inside this select I'll pass our select to do select. Okay. Now after this NgOnInit, I'll create one more method called load data and inside this method I'll dispatch the load to do's action. So this dot store dot dispatch and inside bracket we will pass the action. So for load all datas I'll pass load to do action, which is imported from CRUD component, not to do. Okay, CRUD slash CRUD dot actions. Okay. Now we need to call this load data method inside NgOnInit. So this dot load data. So that on every page load, the data will get updated. Now for load all the data, we dispatch the load to do action inside load datas. Similarly, we need to dispatch the create, update and delete actions in the respective method. So inside add data method, I'll dispatch the create to do's action. So store dot dispatch inside bracket, we need to pass the action create to do. And inside bracket, we need to pass the payload, that is to do of type title colon data. And after that, I'll pass empty string to this variable new data. Okay. This dot new data equals to empty string. So that once we add new data to the table, the input box will get empty for next state. Now next, I'll dispatch the update to do action inside update data method. So here store dot dispatch update to do action. And inside this bracket for update, we are passing the payload ID and to do. So here I'll pass ID of type number, comma, to do of type any. So now here I'll pass ID, comma, to do. And last, inside delete data method, I'll dispatch the delete to do action. So store dot dispatch and then delete to do with payload ID. So here also we need to pass the ID of type number.
and this we need to pass inside curly brackets. Okay. So this is how we dispatched all four methods from the class file of CRUD component. Now we need to update the HTML file of CRUD component. So inside HTML file, first I'll use the @for syntax to load the CRUD data. So here I'll write @for data of CRUD data. I'll copy the name from here and then paste it here with dollar symbol. Pipe async and then track data. Okay. After that, I'll shift all this here inside this for loop. And then I'll update this ID with data.id and this title with data.title. After that, for this update data method, we need to pass data ID along with data. So data.id, comma, data. And for delete, we just need to pass the ID. So I'll write data.id. Now save the changes. Inside browser, I'll refresh the page. Expected 2 arguments, but got 0. CRUD component HTML. Okay. Have written update data, delete data, create data, and add data. And inside TS file, we have updated all the things. So yeah, one more thing is missing. Inside this update data, I'll add one prompt box to update the user data. Okay, so here I'll write const updated data equals to this prompt box will come with the present data and then title colon prompt enter new title then comma to do dot title. Okay. And after that, here I'll pass this updated dated data. Okay, now let's test the complete CRUD operations end to end. So let me navigate to the browser, refresh the page, and let's try to add a new entry. So I'll click on create button. Then I can see an input box and add button. So inside this box, I'll add test1 and then I'll click on add button. And you can see the test1 title is added into this table. Similarly, I'll add test2, click on add button and test2 is also added. Now I'll update this test1 with test and click on OK. You can see the title is updating. Same, I'll update this test2 with NgRx. Okay, and this title is also updated. Now last, let me click on the delete button and you can see our data is deleting. So this is how we can add the new data, we can update that data, and we can delete the updated data or any data from the table. So with this, we have successfully implemented the CRUD operation using NgRx. Let's quickly recap. We started creating a basic table in the UI using Bootstrap. After that, we created an actions and then we created reducers and then we have updated the service file. Next, we have created the effects and then register the reducer and effects inside appconfig.ts file. And after that, we have created the selector. And finally, we dispatched the necessary actions from the CRUD component. Okay. So I hope you have learned to create, update, and delete functionality in NgRx. And with that, I will wrap up this video, hoping that you now have a solid understanding of state management in Angular applications using NgRx. We have covered all the fundamentals, built a practical example, and explored key concepts. And for your reference, I will upload the complete NgRx tutorial source code on GitHub and share the link in the description below. So keep commenting and keep learning. Thank you for watching and I appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, share, comment and subscribe for more Angular and NgRx content. And also you can find the additional resources in the description below. So see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.